And I want to welcome you to the Humanities Montana series on Indian boarding schools. And so we begin with the essential question, of course. And that essential question is called, who has resiliency and why? So we'll be looking at two OPI videos relating different perspectives and experiences to the Indian boarding schools in Montana. Well, and as I watch these videos, essential questions have popped into my mind, like what is resiliency? Who has resiliency? And why do they have resiliency? We will be watching Assiniboine and Gros Ventre tribal members with two different boarding school experiences. But first, a little background on Indian boarding schools. So I call this a brief but spectacular history of the Indian boarding schools. Kill the Indian in him and save the man. Well, that was the mindset under which the US government forced tens of thousands of Native American children to attend assimilation boarding schools in the late 19th century. Decades later, these words, delivered in a speech by the US cavalry captain, Richard Henry Pratt, who opened the first such school in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, have come to symbolize the brutality of the boarding school system. Beginning in 1887, federal government attempted to Americanize Native Americans, largely through the education of Native youth. And by 1900, thousands of Native Americans were studying at almost 150 boarding schools around the United States. The U.S. Training and Industrial School, founded in 1879 at Carlisle Barracks, Pennsylvania, was the model for most of these schools. Boarding schools like Carlisle provided vocational, manual training, and sought to systematically strip away tribal culture. They insisted that students drop their Indian names, forbade the speaking of native languages, and cut off their long hair. Not surprisingly, such schools often met fierce resistance from Native American parents and youth. And the last two pictures you just saw were the same youth when they entered the Carlisle boarding school and when they graduated. Luther Standing Bear remembered his educational experience at Carlisle, writing, "Although we were very young, wearing our Indian clothes, one day when we came to school, there was a lot of writing on one of the blackboards. We did not know what it meant, but our interpreter came into the room and said, 'Do you see all these marks on the blackboards? Well, each word is a white man's name, and they're going to give each one of you one of these names by which you will hereafter be known.' None of the names were read or explained to us. So of course we did not know the sound or meaning of any of them. Each child in turn walked to the blackboard with a pointer and selected his future Anglo name." We'll first hear from Everall Fox, and he's from the Gros Ventre tribe, and his experience in an Indian boarding school. Now, this looks contemporary because it is. The last of the boarding schools ended in 1968. Can you imagine that? So let's hear from Everall Fox.
We had mentioned earlier about the mission that was established at in the Little Rockies, and that was, of course, St. Paul's. And they had asked the Gros Ventre tribe if they could establish a mission there. And Gros Ventre gave them a piece of land to build a church and a school, and they established a boarding school there in Hayes. And they had, and you always hear the stories about boarding schools, and of course a lot of this occurred there as well. But there's also stories of people, saying that they, were able to get a good education and a good experience there as well. So there was kind of a mixture and a hodgepodge of both of those experiences. But as far as it relates to culture, it really did do a lot of damage to the culture, especially of the Gros Ventre people, because I always tell people that Catholic Church really did a good job there, because they were in fact responsible for, I guess, almost erasing the language and taking away a lot of the culture. And I say that as a person that's a Catholic myself, and just understanding that at least 3 generations of people that would have grown up there didn't have access to the language because it was not spoken, or people were encouraged not to speak it, and they had really taken away a lot of the cultures, and especially the religious ceremonies were taken away or were lost. And you could go back to looking at the 2 important pieces of the Gros Ventre religion, and that's the flat pipe and the feather pipe. And they each had a keeper, and they each had a certain ceremony that was done when you opened it, or when you, I guess, just in the whole process of taking care of it, basically. And the advent of the Catholic Church coming into Fort Belknap, some of that information about taking care of those pipes were lost, and actually for the longest time those pipes went without a keeper. And those pipes were so important to the Gros Ventre people that people didn't want to just guess or assume what to do with them, and so the best thing, the elders said, just to leave them alone. But now there are people that are taking care of the pipes. I mean, there's a pipe keeper for the flat pipe and also the feather pipe as well. But a lot of that information had been lost over the years, and the result of the Catholic Church coming into the reservation.
I just find it interesting that the pipe story of how their culture was lost. And this was what happened during the Indian boarding school time, was cultures were lost. Native Americans' culture was provided by their language and by the stories that were handed down from their elders. And when that opportunity for them to hear their elders and their winter stories was no longer present, there went 2 to 3 generations of culture for the Native Americans. And it has taken them years and years and years to start getting this back. I do know that some tribes have started their own preschools where they're teaching their preschool children the native language again, and this has seemed to help. Some tribes have even started eating just native foods, like bison and berries and roots, and this has helped take care of diabetes. They are starting to claim their culture. Let's hear from another perspective, from another Native American, and how her Indian boarding school experience was to her.
My dad was very adamant about us getting an education. He thought that was the way we could survive in the white man's world, was to be educated. And when I first went to school, the school at Lodgepole, where I started school, was run by the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And it was a day school where we went from our homes every day, and probably, maybe at the most, there was about 80 students there. And then at the end of the 8th grade, I went to Flandreau, South Dakota, which is a government Indian boarding school. And there were kids from Wyoming, Montana, Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Nebraska, and North and South Dakota there, from the different tribes. And so we were very culturally diverse as far as the Native American culture goes. And all of my family, all of my brothers, I have 3 brothers and 2 sisters, we all graduated from that school and left to go there. And we stayed there. We left in September and we came back in May. We didn't get to come home for vacation or anything like that. And fortunately for me, I loved school. School to me it wasn't easy, but it was interesting, and I loved to read, and so I really enjoyed going to school. And the other thing is going to, I've heard really bad stories about people that left the reservation and went to boarding schools, but that wasn't my experience. I really enjoyed it for a lot of reasons. One reason is when the home that I had and where I grew up, we didn't have running water, electricity. And so when we went to boarding school, we had all of that. And that to me was, really important to me. The teachers and the people that worked in the dormitories, the support staff, they were all good to me. I mean, there was never any kind of abuse or anything in that way. And so I can't, say anything bad about the boarding schools. And I think that if I didn't have the opportunity to go to a boarding school, I would not have had the opportunity to finish schooling and go on to do something else. So to me, it was a way to get an education and to hopefully work towards a better life.
So as you could see, Charlotte had a wonderful experience. And what brought on that resiliency? Was it the fact that she now had electricity or running water, and so her living situation was better? Or was it the fact that her father wanted her to go and instead of being torn from her parents? Or was it the fact that she loved learning? How many children have you had in your classroom that just love learning, and they came from a family where same upbringing, and you have one child who hates learning, doesn't want to be there, and another child who does, and that child has the resiliency gene. So I don't know, there's many different things to think about. Is it a gene? Is it environmental? I don't know. It creates a good discussion though, thinking about, did you have times of great resiliency? How are you doing now during COVID? Are you a resilient person? What's giving you that resiliency during this time? I don't know how much resiliency I would have had if I was torn away from my parents and put into another school where I didn't understand the language or the culture. Even with my love of learning, I don't know how much resiliency I would have had. Well, thank you for joining me today and listening to some ideas on how to present to your students or how to think for yourself about what would have been like if you were sent to a Native American boarding school. One of the best things we can do at this time in Montana with Indian Education for All is to understand the loss of culture and what that would have meant for you. I would love to hear from you. I would love to start a discussion or just hear how you can use this presentation in your classroom. A wonderful resource is called Rattlesnake Mesa. These are stories from a Native American childhood of children who went to boarding schools. It's pretty raw, and they're all short stories, so it'd be great to use in your classroom with pairs, sharing different stories, or writing your own, using these to write your own personal narrative to try to find empathy and maybe find situations where you have gone through the same thing. Were you resilient or were you not resilient? So a good read and a good way to help you understand the plight of the Native Americans and how their culture was stolen for at least 2 to 3 generations. Again, I am Kim Quigley. You can get a hold of me at this email. And thank you again. I want to leave you with this quote. Do you see all those marks on the blackboards? Well, each word is a white man's name. And today they are going to give you, each one of you, these names by which you will hereafter be known. None of these names were read or explained to us. Each child in turn walked to the blackboard with a pointer and selected his future Anglo name. How would you feel if that happened to you in school? It's a good starting point, good place to jump off. Thank you for joining me. This is Kim Quigley for Humanities Montana.